because it's about recognising the language of deaf people. Article 21 refers specifically to recognising and promoting the use of signed languages. And that includes doing research on signed languages. So governments have a responsibility to fund research into sign languages as they do with spoken languages. And that's the primary aim of Article 21. In relation to that article, we were then interested to see how many countries have recognition of their own sign language. "44 countries have some form of recognition of their sign language, whereas 49 do not. Now you think that the number 44 is quite impressive, but when you look at the kind of recognition they have, it becomes a little bit more complicated. 10 countries have their signed language recognised in their constitution, and 19 have their sign language recognised in some form of legislation, which means there are 29 countries that have a strong legislative document that recognises the country's signed language. So that still means there are over 100 countries throughout the world where they have not yet recognised the signed language of that country. But now that we have the UN Convention and the details in that convention, deaf people can use this document to lobby their governments for the recognition of their signed language in their country. Recognising a signed language can be achieved through publication of sign language dictionaries. These dictionaries can be used to educate parents to communicate with their deaf children, to demonstrate the capabilities of the sign language to government representatives. There are many uses and values in having a sign language dictionary. Through our survey, we found that 53 countries had some form of a sign language dictionary. But again, if you look in more detail at the quality of those dictionaries and how those dictionaries were published, we need to investigate these processes. Some dictionaries were produced by hearing people who had no deaf input whatsoever. Some were produced by sign language interpreters with no consultation with their deaf consumers. And it's imperative that deaf people are involved in developing the sign language dictionaries of their nations. So now to talk about you, to talk about sign language interpreters. In Article 9 of the UN Convention, the issue of accessibility is documented. Embedded within the text is mention of professional sign language interpreters. Now, when we think about professional sign language interpreters, we have to remember that concepts of professional sign language interpreters can differ depending on where you are in the world. Now, from the World Federation of the Deaf perspective, we think that that means somebody has to have completed training and have completed some form of recognised training. They've been trained how to work in medical contexts, in legal contexts, and various other contexts that deaf people need access to information. And we believe that it's vital that for an interpreter to effectively work in these contexts, they need to have completed a training program which is suitable to their own context in their own country. When we inquired through the survey about how many countries had professional sign language interpreters, 80 countries responded that they did have professional sign language interpreters available. When we inquired what kinds of qualifications were available, only 43 countries said that there was a qualification available for sign language interpreters to undertake. In seeking information about the status of training of sign language interpreters, we found that the countries responded that there were different levels of interpreter education taking place either in universities, community colleges, through the National Association of the Deaf, or other forms of training. And it was interesting to see the number of countries that were providing sign language interpreter training through the National Association of the Deaf, where they were receiving training in sign language, deaf culture as a foundation, before then moving on to receiving interpreter training. When we asked how many years somebody had to train for in order to become qualified as a professional interpreter, we found that the responses varied. 9 countries required interpreters to train for 4 years. Many countries required 2 to 3 years of training, and 11 countries required less than 1 year of training. Now, I know that there is one country, for example, where a person can receive 5 days of training and then receive a qualification and be recognised as a professional sign language interpreter. So there's a great need for us to work very closely with the deaf associations and with the interpreting associations of those countries to try and get the professional work of sign language interpreters appropriately recognised. If you think about other professionals, such as doctors, they train for a minimum of 4 years, sometimes more. How would you feel if you had to go to a doctor who'd been trained for less than a year, or perhaps less than even 6 months? I'm sure you wouldn't want to. So the same concept should apply to the training of sign language interpreters. It's vital that they receive substantial training. Through our survey, we also wanted to investigate who was responsible for paying the salaries of sign language interpreters. And in particular, how much responsibility the government took for paying for sign language interpreting services. Only 32 countries said that the government took responsibility for funding sign language interpreting services. Now that because we have the UN Convention, we have a strong piece of documentation that can be taken to governments to lobby for the need to fund sign language interpreting services. And deaf associations and interpreting associations can work together to lobby the government for these services. They can work together in unity, globally and locally, to work together in a unified way to meet the needs of deaf people. In relation to codes of ethics for sign language interpreters, we found that 31 countries had some form of code of ethics for their working sign language interpreters. So those countries that are better developed in their sign language interpreting professions need to be prepared to give support to those countries that are still working to develop their own professions. I have travelled to many different countries where there are no interpreting associations, but there are people who want to work as interpreters, they want to establish an association. And it's important for us to support these people to be able to do that, because in establishing an association, it gives them more credibility. So countries that have interpreting associations can work in partnership with those countries that need the support to develop their professions. Partnership is the key to progress. My interpreter looks happy, so I have to wait until afterwards to tell me why she's smiling. We did find through our survey that there are many countries throughout the world that have very few interpreters, 20 or fewer. 30 countries had less than 20 interpreters, 7 had between 21 and 100 interpreters, but only 12 countries had more than 100 qualified interpreters. When you look at those countries that had less than 20 interpreters and put that in the context of how many inhabitants they have in those countries, you can see a true picture of what it means to have less than 20 interpreters. And here are some examples of those countries. For example, Madagascar, which I had the privilege to visit very recently, has a huge population, but only 4 trained interpreters. There were only 4 at the time of the survey, but I think there are now 13 who have been trained. But it's a very slow process to grow in their profession. After talking about the global context, I'd like to give you some examples of the local context of 3 different countries that I had the pleasure to work in: Albania, Cambodia, and Kosovo. In those countries, I was working with sign language interpreters, and a couple of those interpreters that I worked with are actually here today. I can count a few of them, and I'm sure you can find out who they are later. But I've always believed it's important to work in partnership with sign language interpreters. And as Marku mentioned, when he and Liz went to visit North Korea, it was important that wherever I was working, I worked closely with sign language interpreters so that the deaf communities in those countries could see the value of that partnership. I'd like to give you some historical context to the Albanian situation that led up to the establishment of the Albanian Deaf Association. During the 1950s, whilst Albania was still a communist regime, it was impossible to try and establish a deaf association. Sign language was forbidden. And the first deaf school was eventually opened in 1963. So only 48 years ago. But although it was a deaf school, it was an oral school. Sign language still wasn't permitted. The communist regime collapsed in 1990, and the Finnish Association of the Deaf